Noah's small hands gripped the fabric of Izzy's skirt with a strength that surprised everyone in the room. His face was red, his cheeks wet, his breathing quick and uneven between sobs. "No go. Izzy, stay," he cried out, each word breaking in his throat, as if speaking them cost him every ounce of energy he had. Ethan stood frozen just a few steps away, one hand half raised as though he might speak, might do something, yet nothing seemed enough to stop the panic in his son's voice. The doorway loomed behind Izzy, her suitcase resting beside it like a silent threat of departure. She bent toward Noah, her own eyes shining with tears, torn between the need to comfort him and the feeling that she no longer belonged in this home. It was a moment so raw, so completely unguarded, that the rest of the world seemed to fade. The wealth of the house, the grand staircase, the polished floor, none of it mattered. Only the desperate hold of a boy who had already lost too much, and the woman who had somehow become his safe place. Ethan knew in his gut that this was more than a child's protest. This was fear of losing the one person who had managed to reach him in ways no one else could. And in that instant, he understood something he had been too cautious to admit. If Izzy walked out now, it wouldn't just break his son's heart. It would shatter his own. Have you ever stood by, powerless, as someone you love begged for the one person who made them feel safe? It's a sound you don't forget, the kind that bypasses words and strikes straight at your chest. Maybe it was your child clutching your hand on the first day of school, terrified you'd leave. Maybe it was a friend who couldn't face the thought of goodbye, or a parent holding on just a little tighter when the time came to part. In those moments, nothing else matters. Not pride, not appearances, not the schedule you thought you had to keep. All that matters is the raw plea in their voice and the question echoing in your own mind, how far would I go to keep them from feeling this kind of pain? That's where Ethan found himself, not as a CEO, not as a man of influence, but as a father watching his little boy's world threaten to collapse. And for Noah, a child who struggled to trust and to connect, this wasn't just about missing someone. This was about losing the one person who had quietly become the anchor in his life. Ethan Reynolds had built an empire from the ground up. Contracts, boardrooms, market strategies, he'd mastered them all. But here, in his own home, standing a few feet from his crying son, every skill he'd ever relied on felt useless. He could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but he couldn't stop the trembling in Noah's voice. He could expand companies across continents, but he couldn't bridge the distance between his son's fragile heart and the fear of losing someone he trusted. All his wealth, all his connections, none of it could shield Noah from the ache of separation. The truth was simple and brutal. Money could buy help, but it couldn't buy the bond Noah had with Izzy. And that bond was now under threat. In that moment, Ethan wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or shareholder expectations. He was thinking about the quiet nights when Noah had finally started smiling again. The way he reached for Izzy's hand when the world felt too loud. The progress that had taken months to build. Progress that could vanish in seconds if she left. So, how did they get here? To this charged moment in the doorway where one decision could change everything. What chain of events brought a reserved billionaire, his guarded young son, and a humble caretaker into each other's lives? And what trials had they faced that made this goodbye so impossible to bear? The answers stretch far beyond a single argument or misunderstanding. They lie in quiet mornings when trust was built one small step at a time, in moments when fear gave way to laughter, and in the slow, unexpected shift of hearts that were never meant to meet, yet somehow fit together. Stay with me, because the path to this moment is not a straight one. It's filled with challenges that test loyalty, unexpected choices that change the course of their lives, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in boardrooms or against rivals. They're fought in the silence of a home where love and fear collide. Before we step back to the very beginning of their story, I want to welcome both new and returning listeners. If this opening scene has already stirred something in you, if you've ever been moved by a powerful act of love, then I'd like to invite you to be part of our community here at Mr. Roman's Story Vault. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Tap the like button if you believe every person deserves someone who will fight to stay, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us, what would you do if someone you loved was clinging to their safe place, desperate for them not to go? Your voice matters here, and your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The Reynolds estate stood at the edge of Seacliff Haven, where the ocean stretched out like a restless sheet of blue, and the wind carried the scent of salt through the air. The mansion itself was an architectural statement, broad stone steps, tall windows that caught the morning light, and balconies that overlooked the shoreline. It had the kind of presence that made passers-by slow down to stare, even from a distance. Yet for all its grandeur, there was a stillness about it, the kind of quiet that didn't feel restful, but restrained. The wide lawn was perfectly kept, the hedges clipped into sharp, neat lines, but no laughter drifted through the air, no music played behind the walls. It was a home in structure, but not in spirit. Inside, the rooms were tastefully furnished, gleaming hardwood floors, carefully chosen artwork, and a sweeping staircase in the entrance hall. Every surface spoke of order and refinement, yet there were small signs of a life that wasn't entirely on display: a toy car left on the edge of a coffee table, a set of noise-canceling headphones resting near the kitchen doorway, and a framed photo of a smiling woman with warm eyes on the mantel. For Ethan Reynolds, this was not just a residence, it was his stronghold. Away from the demands of his corporate empire, away from the expectations of the community, it was a place where he could protect his son from the world. Though lately he'd begun to wonder if the walls he'd built were also keeping out the very things they needed most. Ethan Reynolds had never been the type to linger over personal stories. In his younger years, his life had been a series of deliberate moves, each decision measured, each goal pursued with precision. He'd built Reynolds International from a modest tech startup into a dominant force in multiple industries. His reputation was that of a man who saw opportunity where others saw risk, and who never hesitated when it was time to act. But the part of his life he never discussed at boardroom tables was the part that had mattered most: his marriage to Caroline. She had been the grounding force in his whirlwind world. Where Ethan was intense and methodical, Caroline was warm and instinctive. She had an effortless way of making people feel welcome, especially Ethan. Her presence had softened the edges of his ambition, giving him not only love but a sense of home. Her sudden passing 3 years earlier had torn a fault line through his world. The illness had been swift, cruel, and unyielding. One moment they were making plans for a family vacation, and the next he was standing in a hospital corridor, clutching a paper cup of coffee he didn't remember buying, while doctors spoke to him in words that didn't seem real. After that day, Ethan's life shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He threw himself deeper into work, telling himself it was to keep the company strong for Noah's future. In truth, it was an escape. The office was a place where problems had clear solutions, where decisions were based on logic instead of the unpredictable tide of grief. At home, he was present in body, but not always in spirit. His love for Noah was absolute, but so was his uncertainty about how to help his son navigate a world that could feel overwhelming. Caroline had been the bridge between them, reading Noah's needs before Ethan even realized what they were. Without her, he often felt like he was guessing, and getting it wrong more often than he wanted to admit. The fortress-like home in Seacliff Haven became his refuge, but also his retreat from the community. Invitations to social events went unanswered. Friends drifted away when he declined too many times. In their absence, his focus narrowed to 2 things: protecting Noah and maintaining the empire he had built. It was a lonely existence, one he didn't question, until the day a small, unexpected moment showed him just how much his son needed more than the security of high walls and a predictable routine. Noah Reynolds was 6 years old, with soft brown hair that often fell into his eyes and a gaze that could be both distant and piercing, depending on the moment. He had his mother's delicate features and his father's stubborn jaw, a quiet presence in a world that often felt too loud for him. Noah was on the autism spectrum, and while every child's experience was unique, for him, it meant words came slowly and sparingly. He understood far more than he expressed, communicating instead through gestures, expressions, and the occasional carefully spoken phrase. Those who didn't know him might mistake his silence for disinterest, but those who paid attention could see the depth of his awareness. Routine was his anchor. Breakfast always began at 8 o'clock sharp, with oatmeal and strawberries cut into precise halves. His favorite blue sweater was worn so often it had become almost a uniform. Even the path he took from the living room to the kitchen was consistent, stepping on the same sections of tile each time. Changes, no matter how small, could unsettle him for hours. Strangers were met with guarded eyes and a retreat to the safety of his room. Only a handful of people had earned his trust since Caroline's passing, and even then, his openness was measured. His world was carefully contained, and Ethan respected that, though it weighed heavily on him to see his son's circle so small. Despite the challenges, Noah had a gentle spirit. He loved the feel of the ocean breeze on the balcony, the rhythm of soft music playing in the background, and the quiet satisfaction of lining up his toy cars in perfect rows. On the rare days he laughed, it was as if sunlight had broken through heavy clouds, brief but so bright it made Ethan ache to see it again. In Ethan's eyes, Noah was perfect exactly as he was. But he also knew his son needed more than the safety of predictability. He needed connection, understanding, and the chance to trust someone new. That truth would become painfully clear one afternoon when an ordinary day unraveled in seconds. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, in the quiet lull between lunch and the time Ethan usually stepped away from his home office to check on Noah. One of the household staff, a temporary maid filling in while they searched for a permanent hire, was vacuuming the living room. She worked quickly, focused on her task, not realizing Noah had wandered in from the playroom. The moment the motor roared to life, Noah froze. His eyes widened, his shoulders tensed, and the color drained from his face. The sound wasn't just loud to him. It was an overwhelming, jagged noise that seemed to press in from every side. He clapped his hands over his ears, let out a sharp cry, and dropped to the floor, curling in on himself. His breathing turned fast and shallow, his voice breaking into high-pitched wails. The maid, startled, fumbled to switch the machine off, her own panic making her movements clumsy. "I didn't know," she began, but Ethan was already there, striding into the room, his chair still spinning in his office upstairs. He knelt beside Noah, speaking in a low, steady voice. "It's okay, buddy. It's off now. You're safe." He tried to wrap his arms around him, but Noah twisted away at first, overwhelmed by the lingering noise in his mind. It took several long minutes, minutes that felt like hours, before Noah allowed Ethan to pull him close. He buried his face into his father's chest, tears soaking into Ethan's shirt. Ethan rocked him gently, repeating the same soft assurances until the cries began to subside. When Noah's breathing finally steadied, Ethan looked up to see the maid standing in the doorway, pale and shaken. She apologized again, but her voice carried the tone of someone already making up her mind. By that evening, she handed in her notice. It wasn't the first time. In the past year, more than one caregiver had left, unable to adjust to the patience and understanding Noah required. Each departure was another disruption in his carefully kept routine, another reminder to Ethan of how fragile stability could be in their home. As night fell, Ethan sat beside his sleeping son, brushing a curl of hair from his forehead. The thought that kept returning wasn't anger at the maid. It was the hollow realization that he couldn't seem to keep the right people in Noah's life. And if he didn't find someone who could truly understand his son, he feared the cost would be more than either of them could bear. The house was silent except for the steady rhythm of the waves beyond the cliff. Ethan sat alone in his study, the desk lamp casting a warm glow over the scattered papers he hadn't touched in hours. His tie hung loose, his jacket draped over the back of the chair, but his mind wasn't on business. He kept replaying the afternoon in his head, the sound of Noah's cries, the way his small frame shook, the terrified look in his eyes. He'd seen his son upset before, but there was something about this episode that clung to him. It wasn't just the meltdown itself, it was the knowledge that another person had walked away, leaving Noah's already small world even smaller. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "This can't keep happening," he muttered under his breath. He thought of Caroline, how she'd been able to anticipate Noah's triggers, how she could guide him through tense moments with a calm that seemed effortless. Without her, Ethan felt like he was learning to navigate an unfamiliar road in the dark, and every wrong turn cost Noah a little more trust. His gaze drifted to the photo of Caroline on the shelf beside him. She was smiling in that way that had always steadied him, one arm around a younger, giggling Noah. The sight tightened something in his chest. "I promised I'd take care of him," he said quietly, as if she could hear him. "I'm not living up to that the way I should." That night, he made himself a promise. No matter how much it cost, no matter how long it took, he would find someone who wouldn't give up on Noah, someone who understood him, not just his routines and his needs, but the gentle heart behind the quiet. Ethan didn't care if they were overqualified or came from a background nothing like his own. All that mattered was finding the person who could stay. He turned off the lamp and stepped into the hallway, the sound of the ocean following him toward his bedroom. As he passed Noah's door, he paused. The boy was asleep, curled around his favorite stuffed whale, the faintest trace of dried tears still on his cheeks. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the vow he'd made pressing firmly into his mind. By morning, the search would begin again, but this time he intended to get it right. The next morning, Ethan's study looked less like the office of a corporate leader and more like a hiring desk at an agency. A neat stack of resumes sat to his right, each one printed on crisp, high-quality paper, boasting years of childcare experience, professional certifications, and glowing recommendations. He had already read through most of them before breakfast. The pattern was always the same, highly skilled candidates who, on paper, seemed perfect. But experience had taught him that a resume could only tell part of the story. In practice, the connection with Noah was what mattered, and that couldn't be measured in bullet points or degrees. He turned another page, scanning through details that felt distant and impersonal. Excellent at structured learning environments, trained in behavioral management, CPR certified. All important, yes, but he'd met people with those qualifications before, and they hadn't stayed. They hadn't been able to handle the harder days, the ones when patience wasn't just helpful but essential. Halfway through the pile, a resume printed on slightly creased paper caught his eye. It wasn't formatted with elaborate headings or styled fonts. The experience listed was modest, a few years as a daycare assistant, part-time housekeeping for a local family, and several volunteer stints at a community center. The education section listed a high school diploma and a few completed community college courses. But it was the short cover letter attached that made him slow down. The handwriting was careful, the sentences simple but heartfelt. The applicant, Isabel Morgan, Izzy, wrote about growing up with a younger brother who had developmental challenges. She explained how caring for him had shaped her patience and empathy, and how, after losing him at a young age, she felt driven to help other children feel understood and supported. There was no over-polished language, no attempt to oversell herself, just sincerity. It stood out among the polished corporate-style submissions that felt more like press releases than personal introductions. Ethan sat back in his chair, reading the letter a second time. The thought crossed his mind that this might be the kind of person who wouldn't treat Noah like a case or a project, but as a child with his own ways of seeing the world. He reached for his phone. There was only one way to find out. Isabel Morgan's life had never been simple, but she'd learned early on that difficulty could be a teacher. She grew up in a small two-bedroom apartment above her father's hardware store on the quieter side of town. Her mother worked long shifts at a diner, often returning home after midnight, smelling faintly of coffee and fryer oil. Izzy was the eldest child, and from the time she was 9, she carried a responsibility far beyond her years. Her younger brother, Adam, had been born with developmental delays and sensory sensitivities that made everyday life a careful balancing act. He was easily startled by loud noises, needed help with routines, and sometimes struggled to communicate his feelings. The outside world didn't always understand him, but to Izzy, Adam was her favorite person in the world. After school, while other kids hurried off to sports practice or met friends at the park, Izzy went home to be with Adam. She learned how to soothe him through sudden meltdowns, to anticipate the signs of overstimulation, and to celebrate small victories that others might overlook, like the day he tried a new food without hesitation, or when he finally managed to tie his shoes on his own. There were sacrifices, invitations declined, personal dreams delayed, nights spent sitting by his bed when he couldn't sleep. But she never resented it. If anything, it taught her patience, empathy, and a kind of resilience that didn't come from textbooks. When Adam was 15, an unexpected illness swept through their lives without warning. The hospital visits became frequent, then constant. Izzy stayed with him as much as she could, holding his hand when the days grew long and the nights uncertain. Losing him was like losing a piece of herself, but even in her grief, she carried forward what he had given her, a deep understanding of how love and consistency could change the way a child saw the world. Now in her mid-20s, Izzy worked where she could, cleaning houses, helping in daycare centers, volunteering at local programs for children with special needs. The jobs weren't glamorous, but they were steady, and they allowed her to feel useful. When she had seen the posting for a live-in caregiver position in Seacliff Haven, she hadn't expected much. The ad had been brief, with no mention of the employer's name, but something about it caught her attention. It felt like an opportunity to put her experience with Adam to use in a way that mattered. She had written the cover letter in one sitting, speaking from the heart, never imagining that the man reading it would be a billionaire with a son whose needs might not be so different from her brother's. The black sedan pulled up to the tall iron gates of the Reynolds estate just after 2 in the afternoon. Izzy sat in the back seat, smoothing the hem of her skirt, her heartbeat quickening as the gates opened to reveal the long driveway. The mansion came into view, a blend of stone and glass with sweeping balconies that faced the ocean. It was beautiful, but also intimidating, the kind of place she'd only seen from a distance. When the driver stopped in front of the main entrance, the heavy front doors opened, and Ethan Reynolds stepped out. Izzy had expected someone formal, maybe distant, but instead she saw a man whose tailored shirt and measured stride were softened by a certain weariness in his eyes. He extended a hand, his tone polite but direct. "Miss Morgan? I'm Ethan Reynolds. Thank you for coming." "Thank you for having me," she replied, meeting his gaze briefly before following him inside. The sitting room where they settled for the interview was bright, with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out toward the water. Yet Izzy noticed the signs of a lived-in home, a blanket draped over the back of a couch, a small stack of children's books on the coffee table, and in the corner a row of toy cars perfectly lined up. Ethan gestured for her to sit. "I've read your resume and your letter," he began. "You mentioned your younger brother, Adam. Tell me more about him." The question softened Izzy's posture. Adam was special in every sense of the word. He saw the world differently, and it taught me to slow down and see it with him. He had challenges, noise, sensitivity, trouble with certain textures, difficulty communicating. But he was also curious, funny, and stubborn in ways that kept us all on our toes. Ethan listened closely, his expression attentive rather than politely interested. "It sounds like you were very close." "We were," Izzy said quietly. "He passed away a few years ago. It was hard, but I'm grateful for everything I learned from him. It shaped how I work with children now. I don't try to fix them. I try to understand them." There was a pause before Ethan spoke again, his tone thoughtful. "That's important. Noah, my son, needs someone patient, someone who doesn't see him as a problem to solve." "I wouldn't," she said, her voice steady. "I can't promise I'll know exactly what he needs every time, but I can promise I won't give up on him." Something in her words seemed to land with Ethan. He didn't write anything down, didn't glance at her resume again. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though he just made up his mind about something he wasn't ready to say out loud. When the interview conversation had settled into a comfortable pause, Ethan stood. "Would you like to meet Noah?" "Yes," Izzy said without hesitation, though her pulse quickened. She knew first impressions mattered, especially for children who guarded their trust. Ethan led her upstairs to a room that was more playroom than bedroom. Sunlight streamed in through large windows, illuminating the shelves lined with puzzles, books, and bins of toys. In the center of the carpet sat a little boy with tousled brown hair, carefully arranging a line of small cars in precise order: red, blue, yellow, green, each bumper just touching the next. "Noah," Ethan said softly, crouching a few feet away. "This is Miss Izzy. She's come to spend some time with us." Noah didn't look up. His focus stayed fixed on the row of cars. Izzy didn't take it personally. She'd seen this kind of guardedness before. Instead of stepping forward to introduce herself directly, she lowered herself to the carpet a few feet from him, leaving space between them. She glanced at the row of cars, noting the pattern. Without saying a word, she picked up a small blue car from a nearby basket and began rolling it gently back and forth in front of her. After a few moments, she mirrored the quiet hum Noah was making, matching his rhythm. For a while, it seemed as though he was ignoring her entirely. Then, almost imperceptibly, he glanced sideways, his eyes flicking to the blue car she was holding. He reached into his line and nudged one of his cars, another blue one, out toward her, as if testing her response. Izzy smiled, rolling her blue car toward his until their bumpers met. "They're friends," she said softly, her voice more to the cars than to Noah, but loud enough for him to hear. Noah didn't speak, but he picked up the second car and rolled it back toward her. It was a small exchange, but to Ethan, who was watching quietly from the doorway, it was more than he'd seen from his son with a stranger in months. Izzy kept the interaction simple, following Noah's lead, letting him decide how much to give. She didn't ask questions or try to steer the play. She simply shared the space, the movement, and the unspoken agreement that this was a safe moment. When Noah finally looked at her directly, just for a second, it felt like a door cracking open. By the time they left the playroom, Ethan had seen enough to know this meeting wasn't like the others. Most applicants had tried too hard to win Noah over, talking too much, asking too many questions, reaching in before he was ready. Izzy had done the opposite. She'd let Noah set the pace, giving him space while still showing she was there. They walked back to the sitting room, and Ethan motioned for her to sit again. "I've interviewed a lot of people for this position," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Most of them have impressive credentials, but it's been rare to see someone connect with Noah, even in a small way, on a first meeting." Izzy's expression was modest. "I'm glad he let me join his game. Sometimes that's the biggest step, just letting someone in." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'd like to offer you the position. It would be live-in, if you're comfortable with that. You'd have your own space on the property, and we can go over the details, but the most important part is that you'd be here for Noah, day to day, consistently." For a moment, Izzy was silent, processing the offer. She'd taken jobs before that paid the bills, but this felt different. This was a chance to use the years of quiet lessons her brother had taught her, and to give a child what Adam had given her, trust, safety, and the freedom to be himself. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice steady. "And you can call me Izzy." "Then you should call me Ethan," he replied, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. They shook hands, sealing the agreement with a simple gesture. As Ethan walked her to the door, he felt something shift inside him, a cautious optimism he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Upstairs, Noah had returned to his cars, unaware that his life had just taken a quiet but important turn. Izzy moved into the small guest cottage on the Reynolds property 2 days after accepting the position. From the first morning, she began shaping her days with Noah around routines that felt safe to him but also allowed space for small, gradual changes. Breakfast became their anchor. At exactly 8 o'clock, Noah would shuffle into the kitchen wearing his blue sweater, already looking toward the counter to make sure his oatmeal and strawberries were waiting. Izzy learned quickly how precise he liked them. Berries sliced neatly in halves, oatmeal cooled just enough so the steam didn't bother him. While he ate, she'd hum softly or tell him short, gentle stories about animals or the ocean. Some mornings he didn't respond at all. Others, he'd glance at her mid-story, as if considering whether her words were worth his attention. After breakfast, they would walk in the garden. The first few days, Noah stayed close to the path, barely glancing at the flowers. But Izzy noticed him slowing whenever butterflies drifted by or when the sunlight caught the dew on the leaves. She began carrying a small magnifying glass in her pocket, offering it to him without words whenever they found something interesting. It became their quiet ritual, observing ants, watching the way petals moved in the wind, listening to the seabirds calling overhead. Izzy also prepared for the moments when the world became too loud or unpredictable for him. She kept noise-canceling headphones nearby, along with a small fabric bag filled with sensory toys, smooth stones, a soft piece of felt, a small plastic wheel he liked to spin. She never pushed them on him, simply placed them where he could reach them if needed. By the end of the first week, he had started retrieving the headphones himself, when a lawnmower growled in the distance, slipping them on without panic. Ethan noticed these changes in passing, often while heading out for work. Noah seemed calmer in the mornings, less tense before his therapy sessions. Izzy never made a show of it. She simply adjusted, responding to his needs with a quiet steadiness that was already making a difference. It was Izzy who suggested the outing. They had been talking quietly over breakfast. Well, she had been talking, and Noah had been eating, occasionally glancing up at her, when she mentioned ice cream. "Strawberry," she said casually, setting another half slice of berry into his bowl. "You like strawberries, so I think you might like strawberry ice cream. We could go and see." Noah didn't respond right away, but his eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer than usual. Izzy didn't push. She let the idea rest. Later that morning, while he was stacking blocks in neat columns, she mentioned it again. "We don't have to stay long, just a little trip. You can bring your headphones." By the time Ethan came downstairs from his home office for lunch, Noah was standing by the door, headphones in hand, looking expectantly at Izzy. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Going somewhere?" "The ice cream shop in town," Izzy said, "if you think he's up for it." He hesitated, scanning his son's face. Public places had been unpredictable for Noah. Too much noise, too many unfamiliar faces. But the calm way Noah was waiting told him this might be worth trying. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's go." The shop was a small, family-run place near the boardwalk. The bell above the door chimed softly as they entered. Noah stayed close to Izzy, his hand clutching the edge of her sleeve. The hum of the freezers and the quiet chatter of 2 customers at a table filled the air, but nothing too sharp or jarring. Behind the counter, a young man greeted them with an easy smile. "What can I get you?" Noah glanced up at the rows of tubs, his gaze moving from one to the next until it stopped on the pale pink of the strawberry flavor. Izzy crouched beside him. "Do you want to point to the one you like?" Slowly, Noah lifted his finger and pointed. "That's strawberry," the young man said warmly. "Good choice." He scooped a small serving into a cup and handed it across the counter. Noah took it and without prompting gave the faintest smile before tasting the first spoonful. Izzy caught Ethan's glance over his head, one of quiet triumph. They stayed only long enough for Noah to finish half his serving before heading back, leaving on a high note. For the rest of the day, there was a new ease about him, as if he discovered that the world outside their walls could hold small pleasures too. Ethan had always told himself his long hours at the office were necessary, that his company needed him in constant motion, that every deal secured and every meeting taken was for Noah's future. But as the weeks with Izzy passed, he began noticing something he hadn't expected. He wanted to be home. It started subtly. He'd wrap up his last video call a little earlier than usual, telling his assistant he could handle the rest of the emails from his home office. Then it became deliberate, rescheduling late afternoon meetings so he could be back in Seacliff Haven before Noah's bedtime. The first evening he came home early, he found Noah and Izzy in the kitchen. Noah was sitting on the counter, carefully sprinkling cinnamon onto apple slices while Izzy steadied the plate beneath his hands. "Looks good," Ethan said, setting his briefcase aside. Noah glanced up, offered one of the slices to his father, then returned to his task without retreating. It was a small gesture, but one that told Ethan his son was growing more comfortable sharing space and moments. Other evenings, Ethan would find them in the garden, counting the number of shells they'd collected along the shore that morning, or sitting cross-legged on the floor, flipping through picture books. Each time, he noticed Noah's quiet attention, the way his son's shoulders seemed less tense, his eyes brighter. The changes in Noah were mirrored in Ethan himself. The stress that usually clung to him after a day at the office seemed to fade faster when he was home in time to see these moments. He laughed more, something that had been rare since Caroline's passing. Sometimes he'd join them in whatever they were doing, letting Izzy guide him on how best to keep Noah engaged without overwhelming him. One evening, while watching Izzy show Noah how to press tiny seeds into soil in the garden, Ethan realized his priorities were shifting. Work was still important, but it no longer eclipsed everything else. The time he was reclaiming with his son, and with Izzy's help, felt more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed. The shift from polite exchanges to genuine conversations happened gradually, often in the quiet spaces after Noah had gone to bed. Sometimes they would linger in the kitchen, rinsing dishes side by side. Other nights they'd find themselves sitting on the back porch, the sound of the waves filling the pauses between words. One evening, Ethan brought out 2 mugs of tea and joined Izzy at the porch table. She was looking out toward the darkened horizon, her hair gently stirred by the wind. "You've been good for him," Ethan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've seen more progress in the past month than I did in the past year." Izzy smiled faintly. "He's a good kid. He just needs someone willing to learn his language." She hesitated before adding, "That's something Adam taught me." He didn't always have the words, but he had plenty to say. Ethan leaned back, curious. "You've mentioned your brother before, but you don't have to answer if it's too personal." "It's all right," she said, wrapping her hands around the mug. "Adam was younger than me by 3 years. He had developmental challenges that made a lot of things harder for him, but he was the happiest when someone understood his way of seeing the world. I spent most of my childhood being that someone—" She paused, her voice softening. "Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but it made me want to keep helping kids like him, like Noah." Ethan's gaze was steady. "Caroline was that for Noah," he said quietly. "She just understood him better than I did, if I'm honest. When she died, I thought I could hold it together for him. I tried to keep everything steady, but—" His voice trailed off. "You've done more than you give yourself credit for," Izzy replied, meeting his eyes. "You've been here. Even on the hard days, you've stayed. That matters more than anything." The air between them felt warmer somehow, not from the tea, but from the shared understanding that had taken root. They didn't speak of feelings outright, but the way they looked at each other said enough. Something was quietly building, and neither of them seemed eager to look away. It was a Thursday afternoon when Monica Caldwell arrived at the estate. She was Ethan's long-standing PR manager, sharp, ambitious, and always dressed as though she had just stepped out of a high-profile meeting. She carried her tablet under one arm and a leather portfolio in the other, her stride purposeful as she crossed the foyer. "I was in the area," she said with a quick smile, "and thought we could go over the charity gala plans in person." Ethan led her into the study, but before the door closed, Monica's gaze drifted toward the kitchen, where Izzy was guiding Noah in pouring water into a small watering can. Noah glanced up briefly before returning to his task, but Monica's eyes lingered a beat too long. When the meeting wrapped up, she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to Ethan, her voice low. "You know I have your best interests in mind," she began, "and part of that means protecting your image. People notice things, Ethan. A live-in maid spending a lot of time with your son, and with you. It may raise questions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's not just a maid. She's the best thing that's happened for Noah in a long time." Monica gave a slight, polished smile. "I'm sure she's very kind, but the circles you move in, they can be unforgiving. It might be worth considering how it looks before it becomes a topic of conversation." Her words were measured, but the implication was clear. She left soon after, but the conversation stayed with Ethan. He didn't like the suggestion, didn't agree with it, but he also knew Monica wasn't entirely wrong about how the outside world operated. That night, as he watched Izzy reading to Noah on the couch, her voice gentle and patient, Ethan pushed the thought aside. Whatever anyone else might think, this, right here, was working for his son, and that was what mattered. It was late afternoon when Ethan knocked lightly on the door frame of the cottage where Izzy was folding laundry. She looked up, surprised to see him lingering there instead of in his office. "I have something I'd like to ask," he began, stepping into the room. "There's a charity gala this weekend in the city. I usually attend. It's an annual event for the Children's Hospital Foundation. This year I'd like to bring Noah." Izzy set the folded shirt aside. "That sounds like a big step for him." "It is," Ethan agreed, "but I think he's ready. He's been doing well with short outings, and I want him to see that the world outside the house isn't all overwhelming. And," he hesitated for just a second, "I'd like you to come too. I think he'll do better if you're there." Her brows lifted slightly. "You're sure? I don't exactly have gala-appropriate dresses hanging in my closet." "That's an easy fix," Ethan said, a small smile touching his lips. "I'll arrange for one. And shoes. The works." Izzy laughed softly, shaking her head. "I don't want to stand out." "You won't," he assured her. "You'll be there for Noah, just like you always are." The way he said it made her pulse skip, not just for the trust he placed in her, but for the quiet warmth in his tone. She agreed, and over the next 2 days, preparations fell into place. A seamstress came to the estate for fittings, and Ethan had a small suit tailored for Noah, complete with a bow tie that made him tilt his head curiously in the mirror. On the night of the gala, the three of them stood in the foyer, Ethan in a classic black tuxedo, Izzy in a simple but elegant midnight blue gown, and Noah clutching a small stuffed whale in one hand for comfort. As the driver opened the car door, Ethan glanced at both of them. "Ready?" he asked. Izzy smiled gently at Noah before answering. "We're ready." The grand ballroom of the Ashford Hotel shimmered with golden light from the crystal chandeliers above. The sound of soft classical music floated through the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. As they entered, Noah's hand tightened around Izzy's. His eyes darted to the clusters of people in evening gowns and suits, their voices a blur of unfamiliar tones. Izzy crouched slightly to meet his gaze. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly. "If anyone says hello, you can wave. Or you can say hi if you feel like it. You don't have to do both." Ethan, standing beside them, added, "You're not alone. We'll be with you." The first test came sooner than expected. A smiling couple approached, greeting Ethan warmly. "And this must be your son," the woman said, crouching a little to be eye level with Noah. "Hello, young man." For a moment, Noah's body tensed, his gaze flickering toward the floor. Izzy gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, and slowly, he lifted it in a small wave. The woman's smile widened, and she nodded as if he'd just accomplished something grand. A little later, another guest asked his name. To Ethan's quiet astonishment, Noah said, "Noah," in a clear, deliberate voice. The guest responded warmly, thanking him, before moving on. They made their way around the room, stopping at tables where Ethan introduced Noah and Izzy in his calm, steady tone. Noah stayed close to Izzy, but his shoulders weren't as rigid as they might have been a few months ago. Each polite wave or softly spoken word was a victory, and Izzy made sure he saw her quiet smile every time. When the evening's program began, they took their seats at a round table near the stage. Noah sat between them, content to nibble on the bread rolls and watch the flicker of candles in the centerpieces. The gentle glow of pride on Ethan's face didn't fade all evening. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, Noah was starting to fidget. His whale sat in his lap, and he began tapping its tail against his leg in a steady rhythm. Izzy recognized the signs. He'd lasted longer than she expected, but the noise and movement in the ballroom were beginning to wear on him. She leaned toward Ethan. "He's getting tired. I think it's time to take him home before it becomes too much." Ethan glanced at Noah, then nodded. "I'll have the driver take you both back." Izzy shook her head gently. "I'll go with him. You stay. This is your event." But Ethan hesitated. "I'd like you to stay too, if you're comfortable, of course. My sister Emily is here. She knows Noah well and can take him home. I think." His gaze lingered on her a moment longer. "I think it would be nice to spend some of this evening with you." Izzy felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at the invitation. "If you're sure he'll be all right." "He will," Ethan said with quiet certainty. He motioned to his sister, who arrived with a warm smile for Izzy and a gentle greeting for Noah. The boy didn't resist when she suggested heading back to the car. He simply hugged Izzy briefly before leaving with his aunt. As Noah walked away, Ethan offered Izzy his arm. Now, where were we? She allowed herself a small smile and took it, following him back toward the center of the ballroom. Without Noah between them, she felt the subtle shift in their closeness, an awareness neither seemed in a hurry to break. The music shifted as the dinner service ended, the orchestra gliding into a slower, more melodic tune. The dance floor, until now mostly empty, began to fill with couples. Some moved with polished grace, others with the easy comfort of long familiarity. Ethan and Izzy stood at the edge, the soft glow of the chandeliers spilling across them. He glanced down at her, his voice low enough to be almost lost beneath the music. "Dance with me?" Izzy hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward the crowd. "I'm not exactly ballroom material." "You don't need to be," Ethan replied, offering his hand. "Just follow my lead." After a pause, she placed her hand in his, letting him guide her onto the floor. The moment they stepped under the lights, the hum of conversation seemed to dim, replaced by the lilting notes of the violins and the faint percussion of the drums. Ethan's hand rested at the small of her back, steady but gentle. Izzy's other hand settled lightly on his shoulder, her fingertips brushing the edge of his collar. They began to move, not in perfect sync at first, but in a rhythm that found itself naturally. She could feel the subtle shift in his breathing, the way his gaze stayed fixed on her, as if the room around them had faded away. It was a strange thing, she thought, to be here in a gown chosen by a man who was both her employer and someone whose presence had become undeniably important to her. "You've been smiling more lately," Ethan murmured after a moment. "Have I?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "Yes. And I think I know why." Her lips curved faintly. "It's probably because of Noah. He's been doing so well." "That's part of it," Ethan agreed. "But it's also you. You've brought something into this house that I didn't even realize we were missing." The sincerity in his voice made her heartbeat quicken. "I'm just doing my job." He shook his head slightly. "No, you're doing more than that. You're making it feel like a home again." They turned slowly with the music, the soft brush of her gown against his trousers, the quiet creak of polished wood beneath their steps. Around them, other couples drifted in and out of view, but neither paid them much attention. Izzy lowered her gaze for a moment, gathering herself. "You've changed too, you know. I've seen you make more time for Noah. I've seen you laugh." "That's you," Ethan said simply. Her breath caught, and for a brief second, she wondered if they were standing on the edge of something neither had planned for. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric at her back, the steady pressure guiding her through each turn. The music swelled, and without thinking, she let herself lean in just slightly, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne. For a few beats, they didn't speak. They just moved, her in step with him in step with the music. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "I don't usually stay for the dancing. I make an appearance, give the donation, and leave. And yet here you are," she replied. "Here I am," he echoed, his eyes holding hers. The orchestra shifted into the final notes of the song. As the last chord lingered in the air, Ethan slowed their steps until they stopped altogether. Neither of them moved away immediately. They stood close, her hands still resting in his, the unspoken awareness between them heavy but not uncomfortable. The applause from around the room eventually broke the moment, and they stepped aside, letting another couple take their place. But as they left the dance floor, Ethan's hand remained at the small of her back, as if guiding her through the crowd was now second nature. Izzy wasn't sure what had changed between them during that dance, only that something had, and for the rest of the evening, she found herself catching his gaze unexpectedly, the quiet intensity there making her wonder what might happen if neither of them looked away. Hey, before we continue, if this moment between Ethan and Izzy has made you smile, or maybe even think about the people in your own life who've changed everything for you, take a second to like this video. And if you believe in stories that show love growing in unexpected places, leave a heart in the comments so we know you're watching until the end. After their dance, Ethan excused himself briefly to speak with one of the event organizers. Izzy remained by one of the tall tables near the edge of the ballroom, her fingers lightly resting on the stem of a sparkling water glass. She let her eyes wander, watching Noah's absence change the dynamic of the evening for her. It was quieter without keeping a constant, watchful eye on him, but also a little less grounded. As she stood there, the low hum of voices nearby drifted toward her. Two women in glittering gowns, their hair swept into elegant chignons, were speaking in tones that were polite on the surface but edged with something sharper. "Do you see her? The one in the blue gown," one whispered, not quite quietly enough. Yes. I wondered who she was with, the other replied, tilting her head just enough to glance in Izzy's direction. I heard she's not part of the Ashford circle at all. Someone said she works for him. For Ethan Reynolds? Really? Well, that explains the dress, probably borrowed or bought for the night. The first woman's voice dipped slightly, though not so much that Izzy couldn't hear. It's not the first time I've seen a man in his position take an interest in the help, but bringing her here? That's bold. I can't imagine the board or his investors will be thrilled if it becomes a topic. Izzy felt her face warm, though she kept her expression composed. She'd worked in enough homes and around enough clients to recognize the tone, not outright cruel, but dismissive in a way that could cut deeper than open hostility. She turned away slightly, willing her pulse to settle. Just as she was considering slipping out to find Ethan, another voice, cooler and more deliberate, joined the conversation from a different angle. Ethan, it was Margaret Langford, a woman whose presence seemed to command space without effort. She was dressed in deep emerald silk, her posture perfect, her eyes as clear and sharp as glass. She had known Ethan for years, first as an ally in several philanthropic projects and later as an occasional advisor on matters of social strategy. Ethan greeted her warmly. "Margaret, it's good to see you." She gave a small smile before her expression shifted into something more serious. "You know I'm fond of you, so I'll speak plainly. Bringing your employee to an event like this, people will talk." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Izzy isn't just an employee. She's been instrumental in helping Noah adjust, in ways no one else has been able to. Margaret's brows lifted. "I don't doubt she's capable, but you move in a world where perception shapes opportunity. One whispered story can shift the narrative, and not in your favor. It's not just about business. It's about the way the people in this room decide who belongs and who doesn't." "That sounds like their problem, not mine," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "I wish it were that simple," Margaret replied. "But you know as well as I do that public opinion has a way of spilling into every corner of your life. You've worked hard to keep control of your image. Don't hand it over to idle gossip." Ethan didn't respond immediately. His gaze flicked toward the crowd, searching for Izzy. He found her near the far wall, her posture composed, but her expression unreadable. Something about the way she was holding herself, slightly apart, as though creating space, made his chest tighten. Margaret followed his gaze. "She seems lovely, just be careful, Ethan." With that, she drifted back into the crowd, her words lingering like a faint aftertaste. Ethan stood for a moment longer before making his way toward Izzy. He didn't know if she'd heard any of what had been said, but the thought that she might have was enough to make him wish they could leave. Ethan found Izzy near one of the side entrances to the ballroom, her glass now empty and her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. She didn't turn when he approached, but she acknowledged him with a faint nod when he stopped beside her. "Ready to head out?" he asked. "Yes," she said, her tone calm but quieter than usual. They didn't linger to say extended goodbyes. Ethan offered brief farewells to a few acquaintances as they made their way to the coat check, but the air between them remained subdued. Izzy walked just half a step ahead of him, her movements deliberate, as though she were making sure each action was controlled. The car ride was no warmer. The city lights passed in blurred streaks outside the tinted windows, and for several minutes, neither spoke. Ethan glanced at her a few times, catching the faint crease between her brows, the way her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She wasn't avoiding him exactly, but she was keeping a careful distance all the same. "You heard something," he said finally, his voice low. Izzy's lips pressed together for a moment before she answered. "Yes." Ethan leaned back slightly. "Let me guess. 2 women by the table near the back talking about the woman in the blue dress?" Her gaze shifted toward him, surprised. "I've been in enough of these rooms to recognize the signs," he continued. "They've done it to others before, people who don't fit their idea of the right background, the right connections." Izzy was quiet for a moment. "It's not the first time I've dealt with comments like that. Usually I can brush it off, but tonight, I guess it's different because it was your world, not mine." He frowned. "Our worlds aren't so different. At least they don't have to be." "That's easy for you to say," she replied, her tone still calm but with an edge of something more vulnerable. "You're the one who belongs in rooms like that. I'm the one they were questioning. And the thing is, they weren't entirely wrong. I do work for you. I was hired to care for your son. That's the truth, and it makes it easy for them to decide what kind of person I am without knowing me." Ethan wanted to argue, to tell her that the people in that ballroom didn't know him either, not really, but he could hear the restraint in her voice, the way she was trying not to turn the conversation into something heavier than it already felt. "Izzy," he said after a pause, "I don't care what they think. I care about Noah, and I care about you." Her eyes flicked toward him, softening just slightly. "I care about him too. That's why I came tonight, because I wanted him to have a good experience, and he did. But I can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard." The rest of the drive passed in quiet reflection. When they reached the estate, the driver opened the door, and the cool night air swept in. They walked up the steps together, but the comfortable rhythm they usually shared felt just a little out of sync. At the door to her cottage, Izzy turned to him. "Thank you for inviting me tonight, and for trusting me with Noah in a new environment." That meant a lot. Ethan hesitated, as though wanting to say something more, but in the end, he just nodded. "Good night, Izzy. Good night." She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. Ethan stood there for a few moments, staring at the closed door, before heading back to the main house. They had gone into the evening as a united team, him, her, and Noah. But now, as the quiet settled over the property, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere between the dance floor and the gossiping voices, a small gap had opened between them, and he wasn't sure how to close it. The morning after the gala, Ethan found himself sitting at the head of the dining table long after breakfast had ended. The plate in front of him was barely touched. Through the open window he could hear Noah's faint laughter outside as Izzy coaxed him through a small game of catch with a soft foam ball. It should have been a comforting sound, but Ethan's mind was tangled. Margaret's words from the night before kept looping back. One whispered story can shift the narrative. Don't hand it over to idle gossip. He hated how much weight they carried. He didn't care about idle gossip for his own sake, but he couldn't shake the thought of what would happen if it somehow touched Noah. His son had come so far in recent months, the last thing Ethan wanted was to expose him to unnecessary attention or judgment. When Izzy stepped inside, cheeks flushed from the cool morning air, she paused at the sight of him. "You look like you've been thinking too hard," she said lightly, setting the foam ball on the counter. "I have," Ethan admitted. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Can we talk?" Her brow furrowed slightly, but she sat. "Of course." Ethan took a breath, trying to choose words that wouldn't land wrong. "You know I value what you've done for Noah. I've seen the difference you've made in his life, and mine. But last night, people noticed. They talked, and I'm starting to think it might be better if, for a little while, you didn't live here." Izzy blinked, clearly taken aback. "You mean, move out?" Temporarily, he clarified. "Just until things quiet down. It wouldn't change your role with Noah. You could still come by daily. I just think—" "For Noah's sake," she finished, her voice tightening. Ethan nodded, feeling an uncomfortable heaviness in his chest. "I don't want him to be pulled into something he doesn't understand, or for people to start treating him differently because of rumors. I know it's unfair, but—" "Unfair is right," she cut in, though her tone wasn't sharp, just quietly wounded. "Ethan, do you really think Noah would understand me not being here at night? He's used to me being a constant in his world. You take that away, even for a short time, and you risk undoing everything we've built." "I know," Ethan said, rubbing a hand across his forehead. "But the world outside this house can be unkind." Izzy's gaze held his for a long moment, a mix of disbelief and hurt in her eyes. "I thought we were building a world for Noah where he didn't have to live in fear of that. I thought that's what you wanted too." Before he could answer, she rose from her chair. "I need to think," she said simply, and left the room, her footsteps soft but decisive as she crossed the hall. Ethan sat back, the sound of the front door closing a few moments later echoing far louder in his mind than it should have. Izzy walked the length of the garden path without really seeing it. The early sunlight sparkled on the dew, the ocean breeze carried its usual salty bite, but she barely registered any of it. Her thoughts were fixed on Ethan's voice, steady but distant, telling her it might be better if she didn't live here, for Noah's sake. It wasn't just the words, it was the hesitation before he spoke, the weight in his tone. She'd been around enough people to know when someone was holding back, softening something they really wanted to say. And what she'd heard in his voice wasn't just concern for Noah, it was doubt. Back in her cottage, she closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about the first week she'd been here, how careful she'd been not to overstep, not to assume her presence was anything more than temporary. Over time, she'd let herself believe she'd become a part of something, not just an employee in a large house, but a fixture in a family. Now, she wondered if she'd been wrong. She imagined what coming by daily would look like, arriving in the morning, leaving before nightfall, slipping in and out like a visitor instead of someone Noah could count on every moment of the day. The thought made her chest ache. It wasn't just about the routines they'd built, it was about the trust they'd fought for, inch by inch. By mid-afternoon, she had made her decision. If Ethan thought distance was better, she wouldn't fight him on it. But she wouldn't stay in the in-between space he was offering either. She would leave completely. Noah deserved consistency, but he also deserved someone who was trusted without conditions. She began packing quietly that evening while Noah was with his therapist. She folded clothes into a single suitcase, carefully tucked away the few personal things she had brought to the cottage, and set aside a small stuffed seal Noah had once handed her during playtime. She'd give it back before she left. It belonged with him. Her heart tightened at the thought of saying goodbye. She could already picture his confusion, the way he might retreat back into himself. But she told herself that leaving now before things became more complicated might be kinder in the long run. Better for him to remember the good, the progress, without watching it unravel piece by piece. When she zipped the suitcase shut, the sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. She sat for a long moment on the bed, staring at it, willing herself not to cry. The next morning was clear and cool, the kind of day that usually meant a calm start for Noah. Izzy was up early, moving quietly in the cottage, making sure everything was in order. Her suitcase stood by the door, a silent declaration of the choice she'd made. She had timed her departure so she could tell Noah goodbye before Ethan came down for breakfast. She hoped to make it quick, simple, a hug, a few words, and then gone before he could process it enough to be upset. When she stepped into the main house, Noah was sitting at the kitchen table, his blue sweater zipped all the way up. He was pushing a small car back and forth across the surface, humming softly to himself. He looked up at her, and the hum stopped. "You're early," he said, his voice quiet but clear. The fact that he initiated the comment tugged at her heart, but she smiled anyway. "I am. I came to see you before I head out." He tilted his head. "Out?" She took a seat beside him, keeping her voice light. "I'm going to be away for a while. But you'll be all right. Your dad will be here and your aunt, and all your routines will stay the same." Noah's brows drew together. "You... away?" She reached out, brushing a hand over his hair. "Just for a bit." His hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "No." The word was sharp, more forceful than she'd ever heard from him. Izzy tried to keep her composure. "It's not forever, sweetheart. Before she could finish, Noah slid off his chair and stood in front of her, his hands clinging to her skirt with a grip that was startling in its strength. "No go. Izzy, stay." Her breath caught. It wasn't just the words. It was the urgency in them. Noah rarely spoke in full sentences, and almost never with this much emotion. His eyes were wide, brimming with a mix of confusion and panic. Ethan had entered the kitchen midway through the exchange, stopping short at the sight of his son clutching Izzy. "What's going on?" Izzy glanced at him, her voice unsteady. "I was telling him I'd be away for a while." "No go. Izzy, stay," Noah repeated, louder this time, his voice trembling but insistent. Ethan moved closer, crouching beside his son. "Buddy, what's wrong?" Noah's grip tightened as if afraid someone might pull Izzy away. "You stay. You stay with me." His gaze flicked briefly to Ethan. "You too." The words were halting but deliberate, his tone leaving no room for doubt about what he wanted. It was as though all the progress of the past months, every moment of trust and connection, had condensed into this one plea. Izzy felt her throat tighten. She had known Noah cared, but hearing him voice it with such clarity undid every reason she'd given herself for leaving. She looked down at him, feeling the tremor in his small hands. "Oh, Noah." Ethan stayed still for a moment, taking in the sight. He knew how rarely his son used language like this, how hard it was for him to put big feelings into words. The fact that he was doing it now meant the stakes, for Noah, were higher than either of them had realized. "Izzy," Ethan said quietly, "maybe we should talk." But Noah's hold didn't loosen. "No talk. Stay." His voice cracked on the last word, and something in Ethan's chest twisted hard. Izzy knelt to meet Noah's eye level, resting her hands gently over his. "Hey, you know I care about you, right?" He nodded quickly, his lower lip trembling. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I thought maybe it would be better if I—" "No better," Noah cut in, shaking his head. "Stay." Ethan's hand came to rest on his son's shoulder. "Buddy, we're listening. We hear you." For a moment, the kitchen was quiet, except for Noah's uneven breathing. Izzy's mind was a whirl of emotions: guilt for deciding to leave, fear of causing him pain, but also an overwhelming sense of how much he mattered to this child. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice low but firm. "If it matters this much to him, I think we need to reconsider everything." Noah's grip eased, just slightly, enough for Izzy to shift closer and wrap her arms around him. He leaned into her without hesitation, pressing his face against her shoulder. His voice was muffled but certain. "Stay." She closed her eyes, holding him as tightly as she dared. In that moment, every reason she'd given herself for leaving seemed small compared to the simple truth in his words. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was watching them, something unspoken in his expression, equal parts realization and resolve. Noah's arms were still wrapped tightly around Izzy when Ethan stepped closer, the quiet scrape of his shoes on the tile the only sound in the room. He lowered himself until he was kneeling beside them, his hand coming to rest lightly on Noah's back. "Buddy," Ethan said gently, "can I join in?" Noah didn't answer with words. Instead, he shifted just enough for Ethan to slip one arm around both of them. The three of them stayed like that, Izzy with her arm still protectively around Noah, Ethan's frame enclosing them both, as though letting go might somehow undo everything they'd worked toward. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the scent of Izzy's hair faint against his shoulder. "I need to say something," he murmured, his voice low but steady. "And I need you both to hear it." Izzy glanced up, her eyes meeting his over the top of Noah's head. There was a tension there, but also a readiness, like she was bracing for something important. "I thought I was protecting Noah," Ethan continued. "When I suggested you move out, I told myself it was for his sake, that keeping the outside world from talking was the safest choice, but I was wrong." He paused, tightening his hold just slightly. "The safest place for him is right here. With you." Izzy blinked, her throat tight. "Ethan." "No, let me finish," he said softly. "The truth is, I was afraid, not of you, but of what being close to you means. Since Caroline died, I've built my life around keeping things controlled, predictable. You came in and changed all of that. You've made this house feel alive again. You've made Noah laugh again, and you've made me feel things I didn't think I could feel anymore." Her breath caught, and she could feel Noah shifting slightly between them, sensing the weight of the moment even if he didn't understand every word. "I care about you, Izzy," Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. "Not just as someone who works here, not just as someone who's good with my son. I care about you in a way I can't ignore anymore. And I don't want you to leave. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever, unless it's what you want." Izzy felt the sting of tears she'd been holding back since the night of the gala. "I didn't want to leave," she admitted quietly. "I only thought, maybe I didn't belong here, that maybe you were just being polite until you found someone else." Ethan shook his head, a small but firm motion. "There's no one else. There couldn't be. You belong here, Izzy, not because of what you do for Noah, but because of who you are to both of us." Noah, still pressed between them, lifted his head just enough to look from one to the other. "Stay?" he asked, his voice smaller now, but steady. Izzy's arms tightened around him. "Stay," she promised. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's hand moved to rest over hers where it circled Noah. Then it settled. "You're part of this family, and we face whatever comes, together." They stayed in that embrace for several more moments, the morning light filtering through the windows and wrapping around them like a quiet blessing. The tension that had hung between them since the gala seemed to ease, replaced by something solid and certain. Finally, Ethan stood, offering a hand to Izzy to help her up. Noah kept hold of her skirt as they moved toward the living room, unwilling to put more than an arm's length between them. As they sat on the couch, Noah curled between them, Izzy's hand resting lightly over Ethan's. Ethan felt the truth settle deep in his chest. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever the outside world chose to say, he wasn't going to let fear dictate their lives again. The rest of the morning unfolded at an easier pace, though an unspoken understanding lingered between Ethan and Izzy. By late afternoon, Noah was sprawled on the rug in the living room, building a winding track for his toy trains. The soft hum of his play gave Ethan and Izzy a rare chance to sit together on the couch without interruption. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know," he began, his voice measured, "what happened this week. It's not going to be the last time people have opinions, and if we're going to keep doing this, us, together, we can't keep pretending the outside world doesn't exist." Izzy nodded slowly. "I know, but I don't want Noah to feel like his home isn't safe because of what other people think." "That's exactly my point," Ethan replied. If we hide away, it'll teach him that the way to be safe is to disappear. And that's not the lesson I want him to learn. I want him to see that we stand by the people we care about, no matter who's watching." Her gaze softened. "That's not just about Noah, is it?" "No," he admitted, turning toward her. "It's about you, too. I don't want to keep this," he gestured between them. "Quiet, out of fear. I want people to know you're here because you matter to both of us. And if someone can't accept that, they're not someone whose opinion we need to value." Izzy hesitated. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," Ethan said. "It's going to take patience. There will be whispers, maybe even headlines, but if we agree now to face it together, it won't divide us later." Izzy glanced toward Noah, who was carefully pushing his train along the track. "If we do this," she said slowly, "we have to set the pace, for him. That means making sure every new step, public or private, doesn't throw him off balance." "Agreed," Ethan said without hesitation. "He comes first. Always." She exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Then I'll stay, and we'll face whatever comes next together." Ethan reached over, his hand covering hers in a quiet, steady gesture. "I meant what I said this morning. You belong here, with me, with Noah, and I'm done letting other people's voices decide how we live our lives." Noah, sensing the pause in their conversation, looked up from his trains. "Together?" he asked. "Together," Ethan and Izzy said at the same time, both smiling at him. It wasn't a grand announcement, no dramatic declaration for the world to hear, just a decision made in the quiet of their own home. But for Ethan, it felt like the beginning of something unshakable. Whatever came next, they would face it as a family. The weeks after Izzy's decision to stay unfolded into a new kind of normal. What had once felt fragile and uncertain, her place in the Reynolds household, Ethan's willingness to bridge the gap between employer and partner, grew steadier with time. The changes were subtle at first. Izzy noticed that Ethan no longer hovered in the doorway during her moments with Noah, as if weighing whether he should join them or let them be. Instead, he would walk in and sit with them at the kitchen table, sometimes helping Noah cut his toast into perfect triangles. Sometimes just listening while Izzy told light stories about the garden or the neighbor's cat that kept sneaking into the yard. By midwinter, they were spending evenings together after Noah was asleep, sometimes in the living room with a fire burning, sometimes out on the back porch wrapped in blankets against the cool air. It wasn't always about deep conversations. Often, it was simply sharing space in comfortable silence. But the unspoken awareness between them had shifted into something openly acknowledged. Their closeness became visible outside the house, too. When they went into town for errands, Ethan no longer introduced Izzy as the one who helps with Noah. The first time he said, "This is Izzy, my partner, and this is our son, Noah," she almost missed it. It was at the farmer's market, spoken casually to an older vendor selling fresh bread, but the weight of it stayed with her long after. Public appearances still carried the possibility of curious looks or hushed whispers, but Ethan had stopped letting it dictate his choices. If someone from his business circle happened to see them together, he didn't pull back or make a quick excuse. He kept his hand resting lightly at her back, continued whatever they were doing, and left others to think what they would. Inside the estate, there was a warmth that hadn't existed before. The staff no longer saw Izzy as temporary. She was consulted on meal plans, included in seasonal decorating decisions, and even teased lightly by the chef when she requested Noah's favorite cinnamon rolls just in case he wakes up early. More than once, she overheard someone refer to her as Mrs. Reynolds, out of habit. She didn't correct them, though she always told herself it was because it was easier not to. Their bond deepened in the small moments. Ethan learned to notice when she was tired and would quietly take over bedtime reading with Noah. She learned to spot when his workday had been particularly rough and would have tea waiting without him asking. They began to move as a team, not only in parenting but in the simple rhythm of life, each anticipating the other's needs without making a production of it. One night, after Noah had gone to bed, they ended up in the kitchen making cocoa. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her pour milk into a pan. "You've changed things here," he said, his tone reflective. Izzy glanced over her shoulder. "I hope that's a good thing." "It is," he replied without hesitation. "I thought I had built a stable life for Noah, but I see now I'd built something quiet, predictable, yes, but not alive. You've brought life back into this house." Her smile was small but genuine. "Maybe I just reminded you both how to enjoy the little things. Or maybe," he countered, "you're the reason we started noticing them again." The conversation wasn't a confession of love, but it carried the weight of one. And in the weeks that followed, the ease between them became so natural, that the lines between her world and his world felt less like a barrier and more like a seam they had stitched together. By spring, there was no question. They were a couple, not in name alone, but in the way they looked at each other across a crowded room, in the way Noah instinctively reached for both their hands when crossing the street, in the way they each found themselves planning the future with the other already in it. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of day where the sun filtered through the tall windows in soft golden strips, and the only sounds in the house were the faint bubbling of the coffee maker and the quiet shuffle of Noah's socks against the kitchen floor. Izzy stood at the counter, slicing strawberries for Noah's oatmeal. He sat at the table in his usual spot, sweater zipped up, toy train placed beside his bowl like a quiet companion. Ethan was leaning against the doorway, half watching them while reading something on his phone. "Do you want more strawberries or blueberries today?" Izzy asked, placing a small dish in front of Noah so he could choose. He tapped the side of the strawberry dish. "These," she smiled. "Good choice." She set them in his bowl, gave it a gentle stir, and placed the spoon in his hand. Noah took 2 careful bites, chewing with that same slow focus he always had in the mornings. Then, without warning, he looked up at her and said, in a tone so matter-of-fact it made her freeze, "Thank you, Mommy." The spoon hovered halfway to his mouth, his eyes dropping back to his bowl as though nothing unusual had happened. But Izzy's hands went still, her breath catching. Across the room, Ethan's head lifted from his phone. "What did you just say, buddy?" Noah glanced at him briefly, then pointed toward Izzy. "Mommy." Izzy blinked rapidly, trying to process what she'd just heard. She crouched beside his chair, her voice gentle but slightly unsteady. "Noah, do you mean me?" He nodded once, as if the answer were obvious, and took another bite of oatmeal. Ethan moved closer, his expression shifting into something tender and unguarded. He didn't interrupt, just let the moment settle. Izzy reached out, brushing a bit of hair from Noah's forehead. "That's a really special thing to say," she murmured. "Are you sure you want to call me that?" Noah nodded again, this time a little firmer, his lips pressing into a small but certain smile. It wasn't the way she'd imagined it, no dramatic build-up, no tearful hug, but maybe that was what made it so powerful. For Noah, words carried weight, and he didn't give them lightly. The fact that he'd chosen this one, in this moment, was bigger than anything she could have asked for. Ethan reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I think he means it," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of pride and something deeper. Izzy swallowed hard, her eyes shimmering. "I know he does." The rest of breakfast went on as though nothing monumental had happened. Noah finished his oatmeal. Ethan made another cup of coffee, and Izzy cleaned up the counter. But every now and then, Noah would glance at her, and she'd see the faintest flicker of satisfaction in his expression. Later that afternoon, when Noah was in the garden with one of his sensory toys, Ethan joined Izzy in the living room. "You know," he said, settling into the seat beside her, "he's never called anyone that since Caroline." Izzy turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't take it lightly." "I know," Ethan said, "and I think neither does he." They sat in silence for a moment, both letting the weight of the morning settle in. It wasn't just a word, it was a shift, a sign that Noah had woven her into the fabric of his trust in a way that couldn't be undone. From that day forward, Noah didn't always use it. Sometimes she was still Izzy in public or when his mind was elsewhere. But when he did say Mommy, it was always deliberate, always in moments when he felt safe enough to reach for her in that way. And each time, it felt like a quiet affirmation. "You belong here." If this moment touched you as much as it did Ethan and Izzy, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell us about the most meaningful word, statement you've ever heard from someone you love. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the moments that make this channel what it is. Stories that remind us why love is worth fighting for. On a Thursday night in late spring, Izzy could swear she had felt the shift in the air all day, without knowing why. It had been one of those perfect days where Noah's schedule had gone smoothly. No resistance in the morning, no overwhelm during therapy, even a full 20 minutes spent happily drawing in the sunroom while Izzy worked nearby. By evening, the house was calm, the sky outside awash in soft pastels as the sun began its slow descent. After dinner, Ethan suggested they take a walk down to the private stretch of beach below the property. "The tide's low," he said casually. "Good time to see the tide pools." Izzy agreed, and they left Noah with his aunt for the evening. The path to the shore was familiar, stone steps winding down between cliffs, the scent of salt and seaweed growing stronger with each turn. They walked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, until Ethan took hers fully. When they reached the sand, the water was a silvery blue under the fading light. Small pools shimmered in the hollows between rocks, tiny crabs skittering away as they approached. They talked easily, pointing out bits of driftwood and shells, the kind of conversation that flowed without effort. Ethan stopped near a large rock worn smooth by the waves. "There's something I've been meaning to say," he began, his voice carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. She turned toward him, her hand still in his. "You sound serious." "I am," he said, meeting her eyes. "Since the day you walked into that interview, you've changed my life. You didn't just help Noah, you gave him back parts of himself I was afraid we'd lost forever. And you gave me something too, hope, joy. A reason to believe in more than just keeping things together." Her throat tightened. "Ethan." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and drew out a small velvet-covered box. "I've thought a lot about timing, about what people might say, about whether this would be too soon or too complicated. But every time I try to talk myself into waiting, I realize something. There's no such thing as too soon when you already know." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, platinum band, oval-cut diamond flanked by two smaller stones. It wasn't ostentatious, but it caught the light in a way that felt alive. "Izzy," he said, his voice steady but warm, "will you marry me? Will you be my partner in every part of life? Noah's life, my life, your own dreams, all of it." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she could only stare at him. The ring was beautiful, yes, but it was the way he was looking at her, open, certain, completely unguarded, that made her heart feel like it might burst. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking into a smile. "Of course, yes." Ethan's shoulders loosened, a quiet exhale escaping as he slipped the ring onto her finger. The fit was perfect, and when she looked up, he was already pulling her into his arms. The kiss that followed wasn't rushed. It was slow, deliberate, the kind that left space for all the unspoken promises they'd just made. When they finally pulled back, Izzy rested her forehead against his. "You know this means you're stuck with me," she teased lightly. "That's the point," he replied, his smile deepening. They walked back up the path hand in hand, the waves behind them whispering against the shore. By the time they reached the house, Noah was curled up on the couch with a blanket, half asleep. He stirred just enough to notice them, his gaze landing on Izzy's hand. "What's that?" he asked drowsily. Izzy glanced at Ethan before crouching beside him. "It's a ring," she said softly. "It means your dad and I are going to be married." Noah blinked once, then reached out to touch the band lightly. "Good," he said simply, before closing his eyes again. Ethan met her gaze over their son's head, and in that quiet exchange they both knew. This wasn't just their future. It was his too. The decision came to Izzy one evening while she was helping Noah with a puzzle on the living room floor. He was unusually focused, carefully matching the edges of a piece before pressing it into place. The puzzle was a map of the United States, and he'd been working on it for days. Izzy had introduced it gradually, starting with just a few states until his comfort grew. She watched his fingers trace the outline of Texas before he set it down with a quiet hum of satisfaction. Something in that moment stirred in her, a realization that she wanted to deepen her knowledge, to be able to help children like Noah not only from experience, but with a foundation of specialized training. Later that night, after Noah was asleep, she found Ethan in his study. He was reviewing documents on his laptop, but he looked up immediately when she stepped in. "You're still up," he said, smiling faintly. "I've been thinking," she began, perching on the edge of his desk. "I want to enroll in some courses, special education, child development, behavioral strategies, communication methods, things that could help me support Noah even better." Ethan set his pen down. "That sounds like a great idea." "I'm not talking about just a workshop or a weekend seminar," she clarified. "I mean a full certification program. It would take months, maybe more than a year, depending on the pace." His brow furrowed, but not in disapproval. "Would it mean being away?" "No," she said quickly. "Most of it's online, with occasional in-person sessions in the city. I'd schedule those for when you or your sister could be with Noah. I've already looked into the logistics. I could still be here every day." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her with that thoughtful gaze she'd come to know. "You've already been doing so much for him. You don't need a certificate to prove that." "I know," she said softly. "But this isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's about knowing more, understanding more. I don't ever want to feel like I'm guessing when it comes to helping him, or any other child like him." He was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Then I'll support you however I can. If you need time, resources, whatever, it's yours." Izzy smiled. "Thank you. I was half afraid you'd think it was a distraction from us." Ethan shook his head. "If anything, it makes me even more sure I'm marrying the right person." The first weeks of her program were a challenge, but a good one. Her days were still anchored around Noah's routines, but now she carved out time in the evenings to watch lectures, read research papers, and complete assignments. Ethan noticed how she'd sometimes sit at the dining table long after he'd gone upstairs, jotting down notes with her hair pulled back and a focused crease between her brows. One night, he came down to find her surrounded by books and her laptop open to a video on sensory processing. He set a mug of tea beside her. "Break," he said simply. "I'm in the middle of," she began, but he pulled out the chair next to her and slid it close enough for their knees to touch. "You're going to be better at this if you take care of yourself," he reminded her. She smiled, leaning back in her chair. "You're right, but I have to admit, I like learning again. It feels purposeful." He reached over, covering her hand with his. "You've always been purposeful. This just gives it a new shape." Her coursework quickly found its way into her daily interactions with Noah. She began introducing small structured challenges, games designed to build his communication skills, sensory activities that encouraged him to explore new textures without pressure. She'd share her notes with his therapist, and together they fine-tuned strategies that blended professional techniques with the trust she already had with him. One afternoon, she set up a story corner in the sunroom with picture cards. Noah would choose 3 cards and create a short story from them. At first, his stories were just 2 or 3 words strung together, but over the weeks, they grew more elaborate, enough that Ethan started lingering in the doorway to listen. "He's connecting ideas," Izzy explained one evening when Ethan mentioned it. "Not just identifying objects, but weaving them together. That's a big step." Ethan's pride was evident. He's always had the ability. You've just given him the bridge to use it. There were nights when the weight of her workload caught up with her. On those evenings, Ethan took over bedtime, reading to Noah until the boy's breathing evened out. Then he'd come back downstairs to find Izzy half asleep over her notes. He never told her to stop. He'd simply take the books from her hands, mark her place, and guide her to bed. Once, after submitting a particularly challenging assignment, Izzy found a note on her desk in Ethan's handwriting, "Proud of you. Proud of us." She kept it tucked inside her course binder, a quiet reminder on the harder days. By mid-year, she had completed her first certification and was already eyeing the next. "You're going to be overqualified to live here," Ethan teased one morning over coffee. "Not possible," she replied with a smile. "This is home. The learning just helps me make it better." And in truth, that's what it was, an expansion of the life they were already building. Her studies didn't pull her away from their family. They deepened the way she showed up in it. Noah sensed it too. He'd begun asking her to explain things more often, as if he knew she might have the answer. For Ethan, watching her grow in this way was more than admiration. It was confirmation that their future wouldn't just be about preserving what they had, but about building something even greater. It started with a phone call one Tuesday afternoon. Izzy was in the garden with Noah, helping him transplant small tomato seedlings into deeper pots, when her cell phone buzzed. The number wasn't one she recognized, but the polished voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Isabel? This is Monica Caldwell." Izzy stood, brushing the soil from her hands. "Hello, Monica. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," Monica said, her tone polite but clipped, like she had already scheduled the conversation in her mind. "I was wondering if we could meet, just you and me. I have a proposal I think you'll find intriguing." An hour later, Izzy sat across from Monica in a corner booth at a quiet cafe in town. Monica was impeccably dressed, her nails perfectly manicured, her tablet already open to a sleek presentation. "I'll get right to the point," Monica began. "Ethan's public image has always been one of quiet authority and business success. But lately, thanks to you and Noah, there's been an organic shift. People are starting to see him as more relatable, more human. That's a good thing. And I think we can build on it." Izzy folded her hands in her lap. "Build on it how?" "By embracing it," Monica said smoothly. "A public-facing family brand. Think magazine spreads, interviews, charity campaigns where the 3 of you appear together. We could craft a narrative about blending. Business leadership with a compassionate modern family life. You'd be the centerpiece, a warm, approachable figure who's revitalized his home and brought stability to his son." Izzy's brows lifted slightly. "That sounds more like selling a story than telling the truth." "It's both," Monica replied, undeterred. We control the message, which means we protect the family from unwanted speculation. It's proactive, not reactive. And frankly, Isabel, you have the presence for it. I could make you a household name within a year." The offer was flattering on the surface, but it landed with an uneasy weight. "I didn't come into this to be a household name," Izzy said. "I came here to help Noah." "That hasn't changed." "And you'd still be doing that," Monica countered. "But you'd be doing more, advocating for families like yours, reaching a larger audience, influencing policy even. Think of the platform you could have." Izzy shook her head. "A platform isn't the same as a purpose. I'm already working toward mine, through my courses, through what we're building at home. That's where I want my focus to be." For the first time, Monica's polished smile slipped just slightly. "You should at least discuss it with Ethan before you decide. He trusts my judgment when it comes to these things." "I know he does," Izzy said evenly, "and I'll tell him we spoke." But my answer's still no. They finished their drinks with polite small talk, but the tension lingered. As Izzy drove back to the estate, she replayed the conversation in her mind. Monica's pitch had been wrapped in the language of opportunity, but underneath, it felt like a step toward turning their life into something curated for public consumption. And that wasn't the life she wanted for Noah, or for herself. That evening, she told Ethan about the meeting. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening when she described the scope of Monica's family brand plan. "Izzy, I'm sorry," he said when she finished. "She should have talked to me first." "It's all right," Izzy replied. "I get that she's looking out for your image, but I'm not interested in becoming part of a campaign. I'm here for you and Noah, not for headlines." Ethan reached for her hand. "That's exactly why I love you. And for what it's worth, I don't want that either. Our lives are ours, not Monica's to package and sell." Her shoulders eased at his words. "Good, because I already told her no." A quiet smile tugged at his lips. "Remind me never to underestimate you." The idea began one evening at the kitchen table, long after Noah had gone to bed. Izzy was sifting through her coursework materials, highlighting passages about community engagement and peer support, when Ethan walked in with 2 mugs of tea. "You look like you're solving the world's problems," he teased, setting a mug beside her. "Not the world," she said, glancing up, "but maybe a small part of it." She told him about something she'd read in her latest module, how local support networks could change the trajectory for families with autistic children. "So many parents feel isolated," she explained. "They're navigating diagnoses, school meetings, therapy schedules, all while trying to protect their kids from judgment. But when they have a community, it's different. They feel seen." Ethan leaned against the counter, considering her words. "You're saying we should start one here?" "Why not?" Izzy said. "We have the space. The estate's guest house could be used for meetings. We could bring in speakers, therapists, educators, parents who've walked the same road. And we could make it a safe place for the kids, too, with sensory-friendly activities." Ethan's eyes lit with that same spark she'd seen when he was closing a deal he believed in. "We could fund it, hire a coordinator, make sure transportation isn't a barrier for anyone. And no membership fees, ever." From there, the plan took shape quickly. Within weeks, they had reached out to local families, therapists, and advocacy groups. The first gathering was small, just 5 families, but the atmosphere was warm from the moment the doors opened. Children played with building blocks and puzzles in a quiet, low-stimulation room, while parents sat in a circle, trading stories that were equal parts heartbreaking and hopeful. Izzy moved between the rooms, checking in with each family. She listened more than she spoke, letting people share without interruption. Every now and then, she'd glance toward the playroom, where Noah was showing another child how to line up toy cars just so. The sight made her chest ache in the best way. By the 3rd month, attendance had doubled. They added a monthly workshop series covering everything from navigating individualized education programs to practical strategies for sensory regulation at home. Ethan took on the role of quiet benefactor, often sitting at the back of the room during parent discussions, listening intently. One evening, as they locked up after a meeting, Izzy turned to him. "You know, this is bigger than I imagined it could be, and it's only the beginning." Ethan smiled, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "That's because you started it for the right reason, not for attention, for connection." She slipped her hand into his. "For Noah, and for every kid like him." They walked back toward the house together, the sound of the ocean in the distance, both of them knowing that what they were building went beyond their own family. It was a legacy, a community that would keep growing long after the night's lights were switched off. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky washed in soft gold and pale blue, the tide pulling gently at the shore. The ceremony would take place on the private beach below the Reynolds estate, a choice Ethan and Izzy made deliberately. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about grounding the day in the place that had been witness to so much of their story. Rows of white wooden chairs lined the sand, each draped with a small spray of wildflowers tied in soft blue ribbon. The aisle was a simple runner of woven seagrass, leading to an arch decorated with more wildflowers and strands of white linen that moved with the breeze. Guests filtered in slowly, their voices hushed, their attention caught between the beauty of the view and the anticipation in the air. Back in the main house, Izzy stood before a tall mirror, her gown simple and elegant, the skirt flowing in soft layers that swayed when she moved. A few delicate pearls adorned her hair, and her bouquet was made of the same wildflowers that lined the aisle. She held it loosely, focusing instead on the sound of Noah's laughter from the next room. When he appeared, dressed in a light gray suit with a small satin pillow in his hands, her breath caught. "You look so handsome," she told him, crouching down to his level. He gave a shy smile. "I carry the rings?" "You do," she said softly. "You're a very important part of today." Ethan waited at the arch, his gaze never leaving the path between them as the music began. Guests rose, and Noah took his role seriously, walking slowly down the aisle with careful steps, his eyes occasionally darting toward Izzy to make sure she was close behind. When he reached Ethan, he handed over the pillow without a word, but his small hand lingered on his father's for a moment before he stepped aside to stand with his aunt. Then it was Izzy's turn. The wind caught the hem of her dress as she walked, and Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. When she reached him, he took her hands, the warmth of her skin grounding him in the moment. The officiant's words were simple but heartfelt, weaving in the importance of patience, trust, and the kind of love that grows steadily through shared challenges. When it came time for vows, Ethan spoke first, his voice steady. "You didn't just join my life, you changed it. You made our house a home again, and you gave Noah something priceless, the safety to be himself. I promise to keep building that safety with you every day." Izzy's vows were spoken with quiet conviction. "You've given me more than a place in your home. You've given me a place in your hearts. I promise to stand with you, to protect what we've built, and to love both of you without conditions." They exchanged rings, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Noah's small voice piped up, clear enough for everyone to hear, "Kiss." Laughter rippled through the crowd as Ethan obliged, pulling Izzy close under the arch while the tide rolled in behind them. Among the guests seated on the sand were faces Izzy hadn't expected to see, people she remembered from the gala months earlier, the same people whose sidelong glances and whispered words had once made her feel like she didn't belong. Margaret Langford was there, her emerald scarf fluttering in the breeze. She caught Izzy's eye during the signing of the marriage certificate and gave a subtle approving nod. Later, she approached during the reception. "You proved me wrong," Margaret said without preamble, "and I'm glad for it. I see now this isn't a story about appearances. It's a story about what's right for your family, and that's harder to come by than I'd like to admit." Izzy smiled, genuinely touched. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Even Monica, who had been polite but persistent about the family brand idea, arrived with a gift, a framed photograph of a quiet moment she had once captured at a charity event, Ethan, Izzy, and Noah walking together, unaware of the camera. "I may not have understood before," Monica said, handing it over, "but I do now. Some things are more powerful than publicity." Ethan accepted the frame with a nod. "Some things are worth protecting more than promoting," he replied. As the sun dipped lower and the reception flowed into toasts, Izzy noticed that the conversations around her had shifted. No one was speculating, no one was measuring her against a standard she'd never agreed to. They were talking about the ceremony, the food, the view, and laughing with her instead of about her. It wasn't that their approval defined her worth, but it was a quiet victory to see how love, shown consistently over time, could turn doubt into respect. The reception wound down as twilight settled in, the guests lingering over the last slices of cake and the soft strains of music from the hired quartet. Lanterns hung from driftwood posts along the beach, their light flickering across the sand. Ethan and Izzy had decided to slip away quietly before the last goodbyes. They exchanged warm embraces with family and friends, promising to meet again soon, then turned toward the shoreline. Noah had been with his aunt for most of the evening, but when he spotted them heading down the path toward the water, he broke into a run. "Wait for me," he called, his little voice carrying over the sound of the waves. Izzy crouched to catch him as he barreled into her arms, his small hands gripping her dress without concern for the sand clinging to his palms. Ethan reached them moments later, ruffling Noah's hair before taking his hand. "Shall we walk?" Ethan asked, glancing between them. Noah nodded eagerly, and together they began making their way along the damp, packed sand where the tide had recently receded. The air was cool, touched with salt, and the moon was beginning to rise, casting a pale path across the water's surface. They didn't talk much at first. Noah darted ahead, stopping to inspect shells and bits of driftwood, then returning to walk between them. At one point, he spotted a cluster of tiny sand crabs and crouched low to watch them scurry. Izzy joined him, pointing out the different patterns in their shells while Ethan stood just behind them, his expression soft in the lantern light. Halfway down the beach, they paused to watch the waves roll in and out. Noah slipped his hand into Izzy's left one, the other into Ethan's right, his head tilting back to look up at the sky. The stars were beginning to emerge, scattered pinpricks above the horizon. It was then, without warning, that he spoke. "Mommy, Daddy." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of something monumental. Izzy turned her head sharply, searching his face to make sure she'd heard him right. His eyes were steady, his expression calm, as if naming them both that way was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around Noah's. "Say that again, buddy?" he asked, his voice careful but full of hope. Noah looked at him, then at Izzy. "Mommy, Daddy." A small smile tugged at his lips. Izzy felt her eyes sting, the tide whispering at her feet as the moment etched itself into her memory. She bent to kiss the top of his head, her voice catching as she whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly who we are." Ethan crouched down to join them, resting a hand on each of their shoulders. "You have no idea what that means to us," he said softly, though his eyes told Noah he understood at least some of it. For a few long seconds they simply stayed like that, three silhouettes framed against the moonlit water, hands linked. The world narrowed to the sound of the waves and the certainty of belonging. When they resumed their walk, Noah ran ahead again, calling back over his shoulder, "Come on, Mommy. Come on, Daddy." His voice carried laughter now, light and unburdened. Izzy and Ethan followed, side by side, exchanging a glance that needed no translation. Whatever had come before, the doubts, the whispers, the moments of uncertainty, had led to this, a child running freely across the sand, calling them by the names they had both longed to hear. As the lights of the reception faded into the distance, the three of them moved farther down the shoreline, their footprints trailing behind them, soon to be washed away by the next tide. But the moment itself was indelible, written not in sand, but in the shared heart of a family that had chosen each other. The morning after the wedding was quiet, the beach below the Reynolds estate holding only the soft imprints of yesterday's chairs and a scattering of wildflower petals. Inside, life carried on with a steady rhythm. Noah in the sunroom with his trains, Ethan making coffee, Izzy jotting notes for the next meeting of their growing support network for families with autistic children. Their vows the day before had been beautiful, but the ceremony wasn't the end. It was another beginning. What they had built was rooted in something far deeper than a single day, the choice made again and again to stand by each other. Over time, Ethan came to see how much fear had once dictated his life. Fear of gossip, fear of failing Noah, fear of letting anyone close. Izzy had shifted that, patiently, steadily, through her presence. Her love wasn't grand gestures, it was showing up every day, learning Noah's world without trying to change it, celebrating every victory no matter how small. What others once questioned had become impossible to deny. They learned that love, patience, and courage carry more weight than social approval ever could. And they discovered a different kind of wealth, not the kind Ethan had built in boardrooms, but the kind found in unguarded laughter, at the breakfast table, in quiet walks along the shore, and in the certainty that home is made by the people inside it. Noah's growth was proof of the power of trust. He had gone from avoiding eye contact to meeting theirs with confidence, from single words to stories told in his own voice, from clinging to routine to carrying the rings at their wedding. His bond with Izzy had been woven slowly through hundreds of quiet, consistent moments, and it had changed all of them. The support network they launched together became a safe harbor for other families, proof that what they'd built in their own home could ripple outward. In helping others, they found themselves even more anchored in their purpose. Their life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges, hard days, and moments of uncertainty, but the foundation they'd built together didn't waver. Because real love isn't about avoiding storms, it's about holding on through them, knowing you're not alone. You've walked alongside Ethan, Izzy, and Noah through doubt, change, and moments that will stay with them forever. Their story shows us that love grows in the everyday choices we make, that patience can transform lives, and that true courage is loving without conditions. Now I want to hear from you. What did you take away from Ethan, Izzy, and Noah's story? Was it about family? About standing your ground against judgment? Or about the quiet ways we can help each other grow? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your insight might just be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, stories that remind us of the power of kindness and connection, tap subscribe and join us for the next one. You never know. The next story might be the one that changes how you see your own